Happy Sabbath, church family. I want to introduce our guest speaker this morning, but before I do, I want to invite you, if you know somebody who you know would be blessed by the information that we will be receiving today, this topic of addiction and recovery, I want to invite you to just send them a text message, let them know they can find us on YouTube, they can find us on our Facebook page, and they can tune in that way and be blessed. This is a great opportunity for us to learn together. Chaplain Shane Sims of the Athens-Clarke County Police Department is a native of Athens. Having been born in the late 70s, he came of age during the crack cocaine epidemic that swept across the country during the 80s and 90s. It was an epidemic that eventually found its way to the doorsteps of his family's home. A close family member introduced his parents to the drug of crack cocaine, and addiction soon followed. His mother would eventually succumb to an illness that was exacerbated, if not caused, by her addiction. Shane would develop his own addiction to marijuana and alcohol during his early teens, which led to a devastating shift both within and outside of himself. At the age of 18, during his senior year in high school, he was sentenced to life plus 15 years in prison for accessory to felony murder and armed robbery. This marked a turning point in his life. While incarcerated, Shane refused to do drugs, although they were very present. Instead, he just dedicated himself to personal growth, helping others. He would develop a reputation that not only led to his freedom, but also paved the path to his career today as a certified addiction recovery empowerment specialist, which I think appropriately spells the word CARES. He's also co-owner and director of a recovery home for men called Modern Pathways to Recovery, and a motivational speaker. Shane uses his lived experience and training to help people understand the nature of the horrible disease of addiction. Shane also sits on the board of directors of the Athens Tutorial Program, which is a tutorial program for at-risk students, as well as the Athens Reentry Collaborative, a group that consists of formerly incarcerated individuals and allies collaborating to improve reentry from prisons and jails to the Athens-Clarke County area. Chaplain Shane Sims, I'm so grateful that you are here with us. We are excited to hear your story and to learn from you. And after he has shared his story, he and I will sit up here and we'll invite you to share questions that you may have. And at that time, we'll put a phone number on the screen so that you can text your questions into that number. If you don't text, you can share your question with someone who does text, and they can share it that way. Thank you so much, and thank you, Chaplain Shane.
Good morning. After paying homage to God, I would like to first thank Chaplain Michaela for giving me this opportunity to be here with you today. As a religious person, I found that some of the most difficult people to speak with about substance abuse are religious people. And it's often because we operate from our own paradigms. The blessing as well as the curse of this is that we often fail to consider things outside their paradigm as it has been given to us. For me, one of the most important roles of the religious body is not to be so much focused on what a person is doing that we fail to ask the question, what was done to them? When we're dealing with substance abuse, if we don't understand the way into that dark hole, we will never, as a church body, as a community, as a country, find our way out. So the greatest question has to be, what will cause an individual, as innocently as we are created, to give their lives over to addiction? I recently spoke with a group of children, and I wanted these children to understand that you cannot take for granted that your innocence will always be intact. You cannot take for granted that you will always be this innocent child that you are. And this is the same for adults. And I wanted the children to understand, how do you go from being a functional person to being dependent on a substance to the extent that will cause you to lose your wealth, your family, and in my mother's case, your own life. And my question to the children was, have either of you ever hurt yourself real bad before? That you caused yourself to bleed? And of course, the answer was yes. The next question to them was, when you were hurt, what was the first thing that came to mind? What was the first thing you wanted to do? And after a minute or so of silence, one of the more prudent children said, well, I wanted to make it stop. I said, now when it comes to stopping the pain, a nanny as I call it, a boo-boo, I want you to share with me some of the silliest things you've ever done. And that led to this bright conversation about, I did this and I did that. And you can see parents in the room like. And so I explained to the children, and by way of the children to the adults, that more often than not, this is the pathway to substance abuse. It is human nature that we want to escape our pains, our boo-boos, the cuts, nicks, and scrapes of life. It is the nature that God has given us. It is also the nature of this life that God has created that these afflictions will come. Because often without afflictions, we refuse to humble our hearts enough to become servants to God. But for those who do not understand that this pain, this hurt, is meant to drive them towards a healthy destination, guess what's going to happen? Just like those young children, they're going to find ways of making the pain stop, sometimes silly ways. I want to share with you an experience that I had to show you how easily this can happen. As Pastor Michaela mentioned in my introduction, I came of age during the 90s. And for those of you who are aware, this is when crack cocaine swept across our nation like opiates are today. And I can still remember when crack cocaine hit our city of Athens, Clark County. I was a child, but I was very aware. And I can remember so well because all of my friends, parents, had begun to fall victim to this drug, seemingly one by one. As for myself, I felt that my younger brother and I were somehow immune from this. Our parents were somehow Superman and Superwoman because it did not happen to us. But I was a child who didn't realize that the reality of today can be quickly turned tomorrow. My recognition that something was going on didn't start as a suspicion that my parents were doing the drug or crack cocaine. It started with them going into a spare room of our house. When they would go into the spare room, they would remove the doorknob. And so this carried on for a period of time. I can't quite recall how long. But I remember one evening while playing with my younger brother in the hallway, I finally got up the courage, or the childish curiosity or nosiness, to peep in that door. And I can remember kind of ushering my younger brother away from the door so that I can position myself. I think I came just high enough to look in the door. And once my plan was in play, I made my way to the door, and what I peeped in and saw devastated me. I was probably about 12 or 13 years old at the time. There were my parents, my hero and shero, my Superwoman and He-Man, doing the drug of crack cocaine. My father was holding the lighter while my mother was pulling from what I knew to be the paraphernalia of which crack cocaine is smoked on. And to say that that moment devastated me would be an understatement. Until then, I was a good child. I had attended Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts. I played sports. I did well in school. I engaged in social activity. I went to church regularly. I even went to Bible study. But it's as if I can remember in that moment my entire faith in anything structured failing. I couldn't articulate it then, but my childish mind said that if I can't trust my parents, the ones whom I had known my whole life, the one who had protected me, provided for me, then who could I trust? And that broke my relationship with the church as well. I can remember that night ushering my younger brother off the hallway. He was oblivious of what was going on. But I remember ushering him off the hallway, and I left from the hall door, went through the living room, and out of the front door of our home. Both literally and metaphorically. I was hurt. I felt the sense of devastation that no child should feel. I felt the sense of betrayal. I felt the loss of trust. And even as a child, one thing that we know, like those children that day, is that we want the pain to stop. So I searched, and I had no idea what I was searching for. If we as a church body, as a religious body, don't do our job in making sure that the solutions, the comforts are there, then this world will. And that's exactly what happened to me. The streets of Athens, Clarke County welcomed me with open arms. I became one of the many broken kids that were already in the streets. And they knew what I needed because they themselves had already gone through this transition. I was soon introduced to the drug of marijuana. And although my parents, in their addiction, had said, don't do drugs, don't do drugs. It was a minute that I went between the streets and home, and my parents telling us, because they knew that we now knew what was going on, don't do drugs. But the reality is that if you don't give an alternative, then you're going to search for that solution. I remember smoking my first joint of marijuana, and the worst thing in the world happened. It really did make the pain stop. It made it stop. It went away. So you take a person, not just a child, any person that is hurting, that is searching, and you say, hey, don't go there. Don't let your pain drive you there. But you give them no alternative. Then the world gives them alternative and say, hey, come here. It will make the pain stop. Ultimately, what do you think will be the choice of that person? We're human beings. We want the pain to stop. So while that first choice may have been based off a decision, guess what drugs do? They physically alter the brain. They physically change the level of chemicals that each and every one of us experience that makes us feel like life is okay. And then the body becomes dependent upon that drug to say, hey, I'm all right. And addiction starts. For myself, by the age of 14, my first daughter was born. By the age of 15, I was not only doing marijuana and alcohol, but I had also begun to sell crack cocaine, the very thing that destroyed my home. By the age of 17, I had an entirely different circumstance. But fortunately, school was easy enough for me to some kind of way meander my way through it. But in my senior year of high school, I had to pick. And in choosing the stability that I had long lost versus this newfound freedom, this newfound fraternity of the streets, I chose the latter. And to show you how easily Satan sets the stage for the worst of decisions. At this point, my senior year of high school, taking care of myself, taking care of my younger brother, my parents' addiction at its peak, I still somehow found the muscle, the strength to work. I would go to school, come home, go to work, didn't have a social life. One evening we came to the job. It was the Best Foods. For those of you who are native to Athens, you may remember this restaurant back in the 90s. It was a fast food restaurant, a hot wing restaurant. I had worked there probably 6 months at this time, and I remember coming to work this evening, and I got out of the car just as some of the other teenagers were arriving. And the owner was standing on the lawn, and I noticed that the door was closed. And when we walked up, he said, well, I hate to say this, but I'm closing the restaurant. No warning, no backup plan. This is it. For the other teens, him closing the restaurant meant that maybe they couldn't buy that new pair of shoes that they wanted. Or maybe they couldn't go on this trip with their friends that they wanted. For me, if I did not have a job, that meant that, again, my life was destroyed. I was taking care of myself. Shortly thereafter, I re-met some friends that I had known back in elementary school. And I tell you that Satan is conniving, plotting. These friends had already been involved in various forms of criminal activity. 2 of them even snorted cocaine with their fathers. And when I re-met them, guess what they gave me again? That sense of belonging, that fraternity. So it wasn't too soon, it wasn't too long after that they moved into my apartment, began to drive my car, even began to wear my clothes. And for the first time, they had somewhere that they can bring a woman. So I was their best friend, right? So it seemed. And they watched me day after day go to job interviews, trying to get another job. So finally, one of them suggested, one day he said, man, look, you're trying hard to work. You need money. I had a daughter. And he suggested armed robbery as a way of getting money. So initially, my response was robbery. I may have made some dumb decisions, but that was a dumb decision. But I always stress to the youth, and even now to the adults, that association will breed assimilation. And this idea came up time and time again. I can still remember the night that I said, well, how's it going to go? And of course, they're going to give the best narrative. We'll go in, show the gun, we'll get the money. You'll have the money you need. That's it. No harm, no foul. And eventually I said, okay. And you see, they needed me because I was the only one that had a car. I was the only one that had enough sense to say, well, okay, this is what we need to do, right? This is their plan, and they brought me in. I ended up strategizing. That should have been red flag number 1. So sure enough, we go into the store. As surreal as it seemed, I knew that I had to stay present enough to kind of dictate how the flow of things went. We went in, and I remember one of my co-defendants at the cash register pounding on the register. He never even had a job to know the mass cash tendered. A mass cash tender that came open. Of course, you can imagine what was in the register. Not much at all. And as I'm getting the change out of the register, I hear a loud bang behind me, another one of my co-defendants. And I turned around, and he had knocked the camera off the wall. That was back when you had the big video cameras. And I asked him, I said, why'd you knock the camera off the wall? He said, because of recording. So I pointed to the VCR. I said, how about the tape? He didn't even think. He felt if he knocked the camera off, that'd end everything. I knew then that I was in trouble. As we were leaving out the store, the trigger man, as they call it in situations like this, I said, listen, just take him to the cooler and let's go. Take him to the cooler, let's go. We left out, I got probably 50 yards from the store, and I heard the most awful sound I ever heard. There was a loud blast followed by a man screaming. And it was as if I had sunk into the twilight zone. I can remember stopping, and it was nighttime. It was like the world was just spinning. I found out later on that prior to us going to the store, they had gotten high off cocaine, something they wouldn't do around me. And apparently he was experiencing what in the drug world they call the drain. That is the peak of your high. And for no reason, he made the decision to kill the clerk. Of course, this was enough to shift me back. It was too much. I turned myself in to authorities. I admitted my role to what had happened. And the judge saw fit to sentence me to life plus 15 years in prison. It was a steep goal, but my upbringing told me that when you commit a sin, when you commit something of such gravity, whatever the punishment is, you have to atone. I went into the prison system at the age of 18, weighing 145 pounds soaking wet. My first institution was Telfair State Prison, one of the worst prisons in Georgia. I didn't know it at the time. And with a sentence of life plus 15 in Georgia, you can all but hang it up. Statistically, you're going to do at least 35 years before they even consider releasing you on parole. And the older inmates made it a point to let me know this. So I made a determination within myself that a man had died, maybe indirectly, but because of my actions. If my life is ended in prison, then I'm going to live every day in atonement. And I subconsciously fell into the role of becoming a go-to person for other inmates. And what I quickly learned was that majority of the inmates had never even had the honor of having a father in the household. And I saw God's blessing in that. Eventually, I would develop a reputation. There was one particular officer that later on went on to become a warden, and one day she stopped me on the sidewalk. She said, Sims, she said, you know what I'm going to call you? I said, no, ma'am. She said, I'm going to call you Counselor Sims. She said, every time I see you, you're either talking to someone or listening to someone. And I say in the midst of Satan's best plan, God puts the smallest seeds there and blows it out the water. She didn't realize it, I didn't realize it, but she had set the course of my life. I became aware of what I was doing. I was surviving by giving myself to others. And I became more intentional. The result of this is that about some 12 years later, the first warden noticed me. And this is a big thing because when you're in a prison with 500 to 900 people, you're often just a number. No one has time to notice you. There's an organization to run. There's a prison to run. But I was fortunate enough that the warden began to notice me out of all of those men. And he let me know this. Ultimately, this warden would petition the parole board for my release. But anyone that knows anything about the prison system, the members of the parole board are appointed officials, not elected, so they held accountable to no one but the governor. And the governor's politics would determine who, if, when anyone gets out of prison. So a warden petitioning the parole board, looks good, but at the end of the day, they make their own decisions. And so they decided that his word wasn't good enough. Time passed on. A second warden would petition the parole board and say, hey, he's of more use out there than he is in here. This warden had a bit more political pull. It was considered a bit further, but ultimately the decision was, let him stay. Ultimately, a third warden petitioned the parole board. And the reason he did is because one of my mentees, a young guy that I used to mentor, had his skull stuffed in by a fellow gang member. So our dorm went on lockdown. At this time, I was working in the warden administrative office, so I stayed absentee for about a month or so. When I came back the first day, I remember the warden's secretary, she's this Southern Belle white lady, when she sees me, she said, I see him. So she called her, she reined herself in. She said, how you doing? I said, I'm fine. She said, well, we did miss you up here. And she said, come here. I walked up to her desk and said, yes, ma'am. She said, the warden has been talking to the parole board for you. It was first received with some excitement, but you can imagine what happened when I thought about the other two wardens that had done the same thing. And I said, well, yeah, the parole board's been contacted on my behalf. Before she said, no, she said, he's been talking to them. She said, as a matter of fact, a member of the parole board is coming out to the office today. Took it with a grain of salt, went on to do my business, cleaning up the office, talking to everyone, and sure enough, Paige came. Sims come to the warden's office. And when I walked in, lo and behold, there was a parole board member. You know them by their lapels, sitting there. And the first thing she said to me was, she said, okay, Mr. Sims, this is your situation. And she read out my case. That's how I knew this one was real. She began to plot with the warden and said, okay, this is how we're going to have to do this. This is how this is going to have to be filed. And I'm sitting there it was surreal to me. And she said, well, okay, you will hear from us soon. She left out, and the warden leaned over, this big country white guy that dipped snuff, and he says, Sim, he said, I'm going to get you out of here. He said, but you ever do anything to come back, I'm going to find you and kick your beat myself. I said, absolutely, but he knew. February 3rd, 2016, after serving just 20 years on the sentence of life plus 15 years, I returned home to my family and my community. Today, I share with you the story of the power of redemption. We're greater than our worst mistake. When it comes to substance abuse, understand that substance abuse, addiction, is not a moral failure. It's not a moral failure. More often than not, substance abuse comes from traumas, stresses, hurts, pains, nicks, boo-boos that we want to stop. And if we as a religious body don't provide people with solutions to their hurt, wholesome and righteous options to stop the pain, then people are going to continue to hurt and people are going to continue to seek solutions. So I want you to, if this was your paradigm, that those people, when you see a homeless person or a person that's obviously strung out on drugs, if it has been your first response to say, those people need to stop. They need to stop. What if someone told you right now you need to stop breathing? Is it possible? What if someone told you right now you need to stop the dopamine that goes in your brain to make you feel a little bit better? Would you willingly do it? Especially if you stopped it and the result was darkness, right? You're going to start the dopamine back just as quick as you can. Drugs become that in the lives of addicts. Please understand that this world is hurting, as the deacon mentioned. This world is hurting. And as long as this turmoil, this hurt continue to increase, guess what will increase with it? Addictions. Because people want solutions. So as a religious body, I leave you with this, is understand that addiction is not a moral failure. Study after study has shown that addiction is a developed disease. The next thing is that if we're not equipped to deal with the disease, for instance, let's say our father develops hypertension, right? As much as we love him, we're not going to try to treat him right. We may try for a minute with the home remedies, say, hey, I read online that you can do this. But ultimately, if it gets bad enough, we're going to say, look, Dad, as much as I love you, I need to take you to the doctor. And I say that to say that scriptures provide solutions and cures. We're all in agreement. But for every disease, God has also created a cure. He has also raised those amongst us that are positioned to administer this cure. So the worst thing that you can tell someone in addiction is you just need to pray. You just need to pray. You wouldn't even give that advice to your father for his hypertension. You would tell him he needs to pray, but also take him to the doctor, correct? So let's look at addiction for the disease that it is. The religious body should be those that refer them to those that can help them get help. Help them get treated, just like any other disease. And last but not least, do not lose hope. And when I say do not lose hope, I don't mean don't become just forlorn. What I mean is when you walk past that next homeless person, when you walk past that person that obviously have a problem, do not allow Satan to convince you that, hey, it's not your problem. Because at that point, those of faith become hopeless. When Jesus Christ walked, he walked to heal those who could not be healed during this time. He did not give up. He did not say, I have nothing to do with leprosy. He did not say, I have nothing to do with blindness. He did not say, I have nothing to do with death, but instead, he had the hope that made him say that these things can be treated. And guess what also existed during the time? Physicians. They existed. So as a religious body, we cannot lose hope. Hope means giving up on those who are suffering simply because they're not immediately attached to us. If we don't become a part of the problem, then we by default. If we don't become a part of the solution, then we by default become a part of the problem. Walk our faith. Walk our faith. Talk is easy, but the walk is difficult. But when the walk is difficult, the reward is proportionate. Have faith, trust, and become a part of the solution, because after all, that's why God put us here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chaplain Michaela.
We are... We're going to transition to a Q&A time, which in some sense feels insufficient right now. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and not only your story, but what you've learned through your story. If anyone has questions for Chaplain Sims, you can text your questions to 706-549-9592. That's the church phone number, and I've got the phone right here. None of your numbers are saved, so I won't know who you are. But you can go ahead and text those questions while I begin our Q&A time with Chaplain Sims here. Just to kind of set a broader context for us, this subject matter of addiction and recovery comes in the broader context of this last month, talking about topics that we don't often talk about. The first Sabbath, we had a guest speaker, and Pastor Don Keel Jr., and he focused on the fact that sometimes we end up missing the point when it comes to serving the young adults in our congregations. The second Sabbath, Dr. Christopher Corbett, one of our members here, talked about mental health. And last Sabbath, we looked at friendship and what that means biblically to extend ourselves to others. These aren't topics that we often talk about, oftentimes because maybe we're afraid of it. We don't know quite where to focus, that sort of thing. And then today, talking about addiction. As a community of faith, it's so easy for us, and any community of faith, to say, if we talk about it too much, then maybe somebody will start walking down that path. So let's just not talk about it. Or if we talk about it too much, maybe it'll make it seem like it's actually a good option that anyone can recover from. But we know, if we really think about it, that that's not true. As we have these conversations, we get to take a new step in the right direction with more understanding of this topic. And so I want to start with this question. You talked about the fact that we need an alternative. If we find ourselves in a situation of addiction, we need an alternative. And one of the questions that came to mind as you were talking, Chaplain, was, did anyone check on you? As a young boy, seeing your parents go through this, leaving the home, did anyone from your community of faith, from your neighborhood, did anyone reach out and check on you? If so, what was that like?
And I'm glad that you asked that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm glad you asked that question. even now, all these years later, um, it makes me tear up to even think about that. Um, During that time, although the crack cocaine epidemic was there, the church was silent on it. And although without doubt, the church became aware of my parents' addiction, became aware of my younger brother and I absent from church, obviously. The church, I think, took a stance on we have to stay out of personal affairs. And long story short, no, no, ma'am. Um, no one checked. No one came to see. Even like my grandmother, I think back with her, my mother's mother. She would talk to me as being the older boy, but she talked to me more about my parents' addiction than my need as a child. And she expressed her anger with my parents' addiction more than attending to my needs as a child. And so, as I said, I had already gravitated towards the street. So I was fighting to go back and forth. And that was her way of trying. She was trying to acknowledge the reality that I was living in, but it did nothing to address the reality that was developing within me. And so, no, ma'am.
That's incredible. It's incredible. It's devastating to know that no one checked, and you were a child. So often we make other people's business not our business, right? That's very much part of the context we're in and have been in for many moons. I think part of it is perhaps part of North American culture in general. Maybe in other cultures it would be different, I don't know. But especially when it comes to topics that we don't know what to do with, we say, you know what, maybe we'll pray for the person from a distance, but we're gonna, step back because we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. And so my next question is, as you think back to your 12-year-old self, I mean, you've talked about your grandmother not speaking to what you needed as a child, no one from your faith community coming and checking on you. What would have a good check-in look like for you?
A good check-in for me would have been, I know you're going through a lot. And in fact, let me use a real-life scenario that happened. I guess maybe about a year or so into my parents' addiction, still I had a degree of respect for the church. And I remember this pastor had come in town, young, charismatic pastor, and he attached himself to my grandmother. And he began to use my grandmother's house for the Wednesday Bible studies, the meeting place. And so from time to time, we would still go. And I remember one time when I decided, well, you know what, I'm going to go to Bible study this Wednesday. I went, and my parents had gone in before me. And the way my grandmother's house was set up is when you come in the door, if you go to the left, there's a living room. So it's around the corner. And I remember coming in after my parents, and I heard them in there speaking with the pastor, telling them about all the things that I was doing. He's into this, he's done that. And I heard them. So the pastor called me into my grandmother's living room after them. That was ideal at that moment because I finally had a chance to talk to someone I respect, talk to a clergy about what was going on. So the ideal thing would have been to say, hey, what's going on? Why are you acting so? Well, how do you feel about your parents' addiction? What is it that you need? That would be ideal, but the exact opposite happened. When I went in, the first thing he said is, God told me that you're giving your parents some problems. And I remember faith just flew out the window.
Mercy.
I had just heard my parents tell them. The same parent, the same pastor, just to give you some further context, convinced my grandmother to divorce my grandfather. They had been married for more than 50-something years. My grandmother, she was the homebody, the church body. My grandfather was the funny man that everybody enjoyed that drank from time to time. That was just their dynamics. For years, they had been their dynamics. But he had somehow convinced my grandmother that they were unequally yoked, and she divorced my grandfather. My grandmother died. My grandfather died first, soon after, and my grandmother died not too long after that. And everyone in the family is convinced that when you separate after that many years, that a part of your life is separated. And this pastor went on to get kicked out of the church for getting one of the church members pregnant with twins, and he was married. So
Wow.
To give you the idea check-in, I want to contrast it to what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
And it wouldn't have been complex. It wouldn't have been like you didn't need a psychologist to come in
right,
and do
right,
an intervention necessarily.
right.
Right. What you needed was something as simple as what's going on with
Sure.
you. How
Empathy.
are you? Empathy.
Mhm.
Empathy.
Yes,
A pivotal word, empathy.
yes, ma'am.
Whew. Ay. Okay. Focus, Michaela. Let's look at some more questions here. Now, Chaplain Sims and I have kind of gotten to know each other from a distance over the last, I don't know, since February.
Since February.
We've been in a cohort together with clergy from this area, focusing specifically on opioid addiction, what that looks like, and how we, in our context of faith, what we need to learn in order to better approach addiction in a healthier manner, and how our houses of worship can be places of healing. And so that's one of the reasons why we're having this session today. One of the things that we learned during that time, and that you actually reminded me of as we were dialoguing via email, was that the word we typically use is addiction, but there's a phrase that is used that is more effective, and I want you to talk more about that phrase and why that's more effective.
One of the things that we focus on in the world of recovery by training is destigmatizing language. Human beings, we tend to label things according to our feelings versus their utility. And when it comes to substance abuse, what that implies is the fault on behalf of the individual for abusing a substance, which is an inanimate thing. But instead, there has been a push across the nation to destigmatize the language when we're talking about addiction. And so now it is more proper to call it substance use disorder. This is especially so in the time of the opiates, because a lot of opiate addiction starts in the doctor's office. It's the soccer moms who go to the doctor's office to be prescribed medication for pain, and we're told that these opiates are not that addictive. The truth is they were highly addictive. So in this case, it became a substance use disorder because you use a substance that was prescribed to you that developed into a disorder. And while I'm grateful for this language, it was the exact opposite during the time of the crack cocaine epidemic. It was war on drugs. That's it. And I would like to highlight that because this is another aspect that has to be understood if we want to do anything to combat this drug epidemic.
The language we use matters.
It matters.
It matters. It speaks to our own understanding. It speaks to how we relate to people. All of that. The language we use matters. And so, yeah, that's something that I have found not simply useful but necessary. And sometimes we wanna just focus on the simple. Let's just keep it simple. Let's just call it addiction. Let's just call it a substance. Let's just keep it simple. But in keeping it simple, we're not learning and growing. In keeping it simple, we're not able to fully help others. And talk more about why it's essential to destigmatize this. Why is that so important?
I'll give you an example. During my time, a person that used crack was called crackheads, right? And you approach someone and say, hey, you're a crackhead, let me help you. Versus saying, hey, you have a substance use disorder, let me help you. Just the language, the way that a person is addressed in and of itself is going to determine their embarrassment or not. And embarrassment is often going to determine whether or not we seek help, whether or not we allow ourselves to be supported. So destigmatizing language in just the most rawest sense, it gives people their dignity back. It gives back dignity to the human being that God created us as, versus all the things that life has piled on top of us. And so destigmatizing things is very important because it honors the human being that's underneath all of that garbage.
It honors the human being. That in itself is powerful language. For us to be able to look at each other and those we don't know with issues different to ours and say, you are worthy of honor. is a huge step for many of us to take, to be able to look at the person on the sidewalk who's begging for money and say, you are a person worthy of honor. We're not necessarily speaking these words out
Sure.
Verbally, but to just think them as we decide whether or not to interact. This is a person of honor. This is one of God's children. What is that language that we're using? Are we resistant to changing our language? If we are, that's something that we need to sit with and really, really wrestle through. I've been getting some questions, so thank you for sharing your questions. Let's see. Oh, okay. Since you were caring about your younger brother, what happened to him while you were in prison?
Oh, God. Oh. He would tell me years later, he was like,
Take the time you need.
I apologize.
You're fine. You're fine. I probably should have run the question by you silently first.
No, it's, he would tell me years later, he said, bro, when you got locked up, he said, I kept your picture on the top of my bed. He said, I cried myself to sleep every night. And I don't think he ever got over it. He developed his own addictions, and today he's struggling. And it ties back to that moment.
Yeah. 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 And I would dare to say, too, it ties back to the fact that no one checked in.
No one checked in.
This is a community problem. It is not simply a Shane made bad decisions problem. It's a community problem. Shane could have been helped if someone had checked in, properly checked in. His brother could have been helped if somebody had properly checked in. There are ripple effects to the bad that happens, and there are ripple effects to the good that happen too. And the moment we say, that's none of my business, is the moment we've made a bad decision, more than likely.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being willing to answer that question.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
Another question, what are local resources that we could share with those who are struggling with addiction, such as a 12-step program?
I also direct a nonprofit called People Living in Recovery, and our mission is to assist individuals and families suffering from substance use, mental health, and homelessness challenges. And we become kind of a clearinghouse for individuals that are seeking help. And so I can name off a lot of resources, but I'd rather keep it simple and say I will leave the address to our organization. And anyone that is seeking that help, if you can send them there, we always say if you can get them in the door, we'll do the rest. If there's any willingness, we usually take them in, create a recovery plan by finding out what are the needs, what things have to be met. Myself and all of my employees, in addition to having training, we also obviously have lived experience, and so we understand. Get them there, and we'll go from there.
You mentioned the word willingness.
Yes,
If they're willing,
yes,
we can't just throw someone in our car and, we could,
right.
but we probably
But it
shouldn't.
doesn't work, right?
What are some signs of willingness that you've noticed in people?
for people to just ask. Often it's human being. I think it's part of our nature that once we get burned by something, we don't want to go back. That's the classical example of a child touching the stove. But it's also can be the most destructive tendency we have as human beings. Not being willing to risk it for someone else, not being willing to risk ourselves because we become sometimes so concerned with our own well-being that we would sacrifice the well-being of someone else just to preserve our own. And that was not the message of Jesus Christ. That was not the message of the prophets. They sacrificed their own well-being for the well-being of others, even when they knew they were going to get burned. One of the signs of a willingness is a person that keeps asking for help. They may keep messing up. They may. It is a disorder. It is a disease. They may. But if this person is still coming back saying, man, I'm going to get it right. Just, have faith in me, believe. That is one of the most overlooked signs of willingness. And the rest of the signs are the obvious. I need to get help. I need to get help. So I just say, have boundaries. You must have boundaries when it comes to family or friends with substance use disorder. However, you have to look at those boundaries in context of our faith. We have to. And our faith often causes us to risk ourselves for others. And I'm not saying go out and sacrifice yourselves, but when it comes to risking your own, I guess you can say sanity or the comfort, correct. Be willing to risk your comfort for the well-being of others, especially if they're asking for help.
And speaking of help, you all should have received, and if you didn't, when you leave, you can get one of these booklets that are in the foyer, and that has a lot of information about local resources that are available. And I wouldn't recommend just necessarily handing that to somebody who needs help, but you using that as a guide for yourself in assisting that person with getting that help. But if you do know somebody who would, maybe it's somebody's family member or, whomever that would benefit from having the booklet, by all means, take an extra one with you. And tomorrow when we have our prescription take back, which will just be a drive-through, and if any of you can help with that, please let me know after the service. Literally, folks will just be able to drive through our parking lot and drop off their prescription medication, no questions asked, but we will give them one of those booklets as well, so that they have additional resources. We're not assuming that they're an addict. We're not assuming that they have any sort of opioid use disorder at all. We're just saying, hey, here's a resource. You've taken the time to come and drop off your prescription medication, which is such an important thing for us to do. If we're not using it, we need to lose it. That is one of the ways that other people get access to opioids is by it just being available in somebody else's house. And I don't know about you, but I know when I was younger, if I went over to someone's house, I would look through, when I went to the bathroom, I'd look through the cabinets. I was curious, right? So you may, someone just gave me a really shocked look. That's curiosity, right? So you may think, oh, it's just me and my spouse, or it's just me at my house, or whatever. There is potentially someone coming by, a plumber, a mechanic, someone's coming by that may have that curiosity. So if you're not using it, lose it. And no one's gonna ask you questions about it. Just come, drop it off. There'll be a police officer, actually 2 here on hand, and they will be the ones to take all of that and discard it properly. We just need some help with making sure people circle through the parking lot effectively. But those booklets will be given to those who come. Okay. Well, let me make sure. Okay. So here's a question. Let me read it through thoroughly here. Okay, my question is, if you or someone have a family member with an addiction of alcohol, and you've tried everything that you know possible to help, but still there's no change, what do you do in this situation besides love and let them know that you're there for them?
And this is where faith does play a role. because sometimes this disease progresses to the point, and I hate to say it because we're not the determinant of that, but just my professional experience, sometimes it progresses to the point of no return. Um, there does come a point where you have to set your own boundaries. You have to preserve and protect your own sanity. At this point, I would say fast and pray for that person, because he or she is in the grips of addiction in a way that our sober mind could even begin to comprehend. This is where intervention is necessary. This is where you ask prayer warriors to pray for you. This is where you fast purely for not just that person, but for our country, period, when it comes to addiction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Prayer is an intervention resource
Mm-hmm.
that we often underutilize. Um, there was something that you mentioned. Anyway, maybe it'll come back to my mind. Another question. Now, we've talked about someone that we're connected to, that we already know and have a relationship with. This question is, how can I be a support for someone struggling with addiction if there isn't an established relationship already?
The greatest connector is empathy. Greatest connector. I mean, you can connect with a total stranger. About 85 to 90% of the demographic of the population that we deal with in my office at its current location is the homeless population. And for us, it was a challenge because it meant us changing our MO somewhat, because we were used to getting referrals from the courts, a family walking people in. But now you have people that live right outside that are walking in simply because of their location. And what I found, which is something that I knew, but it's just crystallized in my mind, is this empathy. What I often do is, instead of focus on their obvious homelessness, I ask, what was life like for you? What's your story? And when you look beyond the apparent, the addiction or the homelessness, and ask a person what happened to you, you'll be surprised at what you will hear. And if a person knows that you ask what happened to you versus all these obvious things that are in your face that you could get caught on, you'll be surprised how quickly that trust builds. And you may be the one and only person as they ever even asked them that. And I have seen that become someone's breakthrough. So empathy, take time. It's going to take you out of your comfort zone. I know you probably got to get back home to catch this series on TV, but ask it anyway. And I challenge you to do it without thinking too much about it, because you overthink it, because you're going to think, well, if I ask them and they really say something, then I have to spend time doing this and they're going to call me. Don't overthink it. I say, when the opportunity presents itself, ask the question and see what happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Trust that God will give you the next words that you need to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. As soon as you describe that, it's so real. Oh no, what if they, what if they say, then what do I do? And I can't afford 2 hours,
Right.
and and it may not be that at all,
Mm-hmm.
but it may be, and guess what? We'll be okay,
Sure.
right? But yeah, we often go, our brain goes all the way. When you were talking about not knowing, like what that addiction feels like, for the other person, it reminded me of a coworker I had many years ago who used to smoke every day as often as possible. And he said to me, Michaela, the very act of going like this was part of the addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's why part of the reason they have, nicotine-free cigarettes. He said, it's one thing to stop smoking. It's another thing to stop this action. Like, there's so many pieces of addiction. There's so many pieces of substance use disorder that if we haven't been there, we have no idea what it looks like, what it feels like. And so to be able to empathize, how have you, when you think about empathy, what are ways that have helped you grow in empathy? Or how would you help somebody else say, I know what empathy means, what it really looks like. How do I grow in empathy? What would you say to that?
What I say to my wife, I often say that in order to appreciate a thing, sometimes you just got to sit and imagine what it'd be like to lose it. And often we have to sit down and put ourselves in that person's shoes. And that means getting outside of our reality. This is a point that I stress. I do classes with graduating cadets at the police department that are about to go into the communities. Um, Most of these cadets come from, by and large, predominantly white communities that have very little interaction. Even the African American cadets that come through come from rather sheltered situations, have very little interactions with poverty, with what they're going to police. And what I always tell them, you have to get outside of your upbringing. That doesn't mean you have to forget your values, your tradition, but you got to get outside of your upbringing and understand the values, the tradition, and the culture of those that you're going to serve if you want to be effective. And it's a challenge, but we can do it. For a minute, just say, everything I believe, everything I feel I know, push it to the side. Let me put myself in that person's shoes. But in order to put yourself in their shoes, guess what you have to do? Communicate with them. You have to ask them, how is life for you? How was life for you? If you begin to ask these empathic questions over and over again, you get used to it. It becomes kind of second nature to dig a little bit deeper. And you also have more material by which you can kind of project yourself into their reality. And the moment you have that breakthrough, the moment you're able to really feel life from a totally different person's perspective, it is liberating because you break that chain of selfishness and self-centeredness. And so for me, that's what it was. I was incarcerated around guys that didn't know what it was to go on a family vacation, you know? And so I had to get outside of myself to really understand, why is this man so angry? You know, why is he so angry? For a while, I felt like, well, I'm the one who have all this time. I should be angry. But, you know, often the guys only had 2 or 3 or 4 years, man, and they were just such a ball of anger and hurt. And I learned how to get outside of myself and see what was it like to not know your dad, you know? And just the more I began to ask those type of questions, the more material I had to empower me to kind of project myself to their reality. And I began to see life from a whole nother angle, just like, wow. So again, communicate, being empathetic.
I don't want to put any words in your mouth, so you correct me if this isn't accurate for the work that you do. But I know for some organizations, they not only help those who are in the midst of the struggle, but they are also willing to help those on the periphery, right, who are trying to help. If somebody here or somebody watching, you know, maybe they've got the brochure, they've got all this information, but they're just like, I just don't know. Can they call you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am the fool who puts my cell number on my business card. So it's just like, yes, so absolutely. With the guys that we have at the 2 recovery houses that my co-direct and co-own with a friend, they call me sometime at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, like this morning. But I encourage that. I tell them, you know, whenever you need me, that's what I'm here for. Because if you don't have resources, you don't have an outlet, then whatever it is, either it festers or it dies. If it's bad, it festers. If it's a good idea, guess what? It eventually goes away. So, yeah, I am available, yes.
Awesome, awesome. Well, there's so many things we try to do alone, or we Google them, when they're actually people, humans in our very city who can aid us in that journey. So thank you. I want to. We're gonna wrap up soon. Here, I just want to touch on a few things to kind of tie this together. There are many more questions that I could ask you, but maybe another time. Maybe we can have this conversation again, part 2. But one of the things that this discussion just really brings home to me is our need as a community to actually be a community, right? To not be, I remember as a high schooler, I learned this song, "No man is an island, no man stands alone. Each man's joy is joy to me, each man's grief is my own." And it's a great song, and then we're like, be well, right? If we're a community, we have to be a community to everyone in our community. And we have to be willing to get into those uncomfortable spaces, whether or not we feel like we're fully equipped. And this this discussion of substance use disorders, this recognition that it's not a moral failure, as you were talking about, this recognition that oftentimes it's one conversation of true interest that can change things around. Like you talked about, was it a warden that you said, just said what she was seeing in you, here's what I'm gonna call you, and that changed things. This is all part of being a community. And as, I'll speak to us as Christians who believe in the example that Jesus set and have chosen to be his disciples, we have to be willing to see that this is part of our life. This is part of the sacrificial life that we are called to live, as hard as it looks, as ill-equipped as we may feel. This is a life we've been called to live. Last Sabbath, when we looked at friendship and what Jesus, the kind of friendship Jesus calls us to, which is one of sacrifice. When Chris spoke the Sabbath before, there was something he said that I actually jotted down, and I want to bring up here because it was really, I know I wasn't in town, but I was watching online, and he said this. He said, God created us to be in a relationship with himself, and that's our greatest strength. So when we think about what it means to be in community and have these uncomfortable conversations, but these necessary encounters, and we realize that God created us to be in a relationship with himself and that is our greatest strength, we're again able to be in this position of saying, okay, I'm scared, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm afraid of what this conversation may look like, where it'll go, but I'm going to step in anyway. And then what Pastor Don talked about the Sabbath prior, about the fact that sometimes we just miss the point because we're not focusing on what really matters in the lives of the young adults and of anybody around us. If we are truly going to be a community, we've got to be able and willing. We've got to be willing to step into these moments. And so my final question for you, Chaplain, is this. When you think about a community, and a community that's able to help. And I'm not talking about simply like putting on a program. Programs can be good, but it's not just about programs. What are the values of a community that really aid those who are in the throes of addiction, in the throes of all sorts of substance use disorders? What are the values of a community that can really help that community be of true use to others?
And I'm gonna again, with the risk of it sounding cliche now, I'm gonna say being empathetic. That's the first and foremost value. The level of empathy within the community, and being walkers. We have a lot of talkers, and often programs are talking and talking and talking. And I myself get invited to be parts of conversations and programs that turns out to be just talking and talking. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? What are the actionable items that's coming from this? And often, and I can understand you saying not just a program, because often programs are just that. It serves the purpose of the one that structured it, makes them feel good about themselves, but then when it comes to the action, it's like, well, you go do it. I came up with the idea. Well, I got the money, and so what I would say is two of the characteristics is empathetic and doers. Be doers. And like the pastor says, don't feel inadequate. We're not inadequate. Had we been inadequate, we'd never be called to the faith to begin with. And we are equipped. And this is not to say that you will have all the answers, all the solutions, but it's not required that you have all the answers, all the solutions. Only that it reminds me of a story of a religious man. He was talking to a non-religious man, and he said, my religion has an answer for everything. So the non-religious man was like, he said, if I ask you questions and you give me answer to all of my questions, then I'll join your faith. I was like, certainly. He said, because my religion has the answers to everything. And so the man was a baker. And so he asked me, he said, how many grains of wheat are in 2 loaves of this particular type of bread? And the man said, give me a minute, I answered. And so he disappeared behind a wall, and he came back sometime later, and he told them the exact number. He was like, wait a minute, but you cheated. You went to ask somebody. He said, sure. He said, I told you my religion has the answer. My religion said, if I don't know, go ask someone. So to say that you don't have to be proficient in any of the sciences, simply be willing, because once the need comes, you're intelligent enough to know what need is articulated, then you say, hey, let's make an appointment to get back together. Or won't you call me at this time? That's when you go out, you reach into your network and say, this is the situation that I have. And of course you have doctors amongst you. You have me amongst you. You have pastors amongst you. You know, and you can ask. So don't feel inadequate. Be doers. And don't let your ego, because a lot of times that's what stops us. You know, ego say, I don't want to be a failure, so in order not to be a failure, I'm not even going to try. So I'm still a winner, but that's not true. Be doers, and don't feel like you got to know everything, every step of the way to take that first step. Empathetic and doers.
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Yes,
Chaplain.
ma'am.
Thank you so much. Amen? Amen. Amen. This has been a blessing and then some.
Thank you.
And such a necessary conversation. And I want to invite us all to indeed learn what empathy is all about and then be doers. There is a community right around us that needs us to be doers. There are people that live beside you or that live in your house that need you to be doers, need us to be doers. There are people that we work with that need us to be doers. And God is right there equipping us every step of the way. So thank you. Thank you. I want to just say a prayer right now for Chaplain Sims, and then we're going to sing a song together as we wrap up our time. Dear God, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the life that you have given to Chaplain Sims and for the new life that he has been walking in for many years now through your strength, through your power. Thank you for his willingness to share his story. Thank you for his willingness to not simply have a story, but to be using what he has learned through his story to bless so many, 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 many more. And Lord, I pray that you will just continue to breathe life into his body, to give him the resources that he needs for whatever his next steps may be. Bless his family, bless his coworkers, bless those who are coming into his office daily for support. And God, whatever we can do as a community to support him through our prayers, through whatever it may be, Lord, help us to do so, because indeed we are stronger together. And I just, again, say thank you for breathing life into him and for his willingness to share his life with us. In your name I pray, amen. Amen. I want to invite us to stand together. You can have a seat. And we're going to sing this song to close. Take my life and let it be. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love, at the impulse of thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for thee. Take my voice and let me sing, always only for my King, always only for my King. Take my lips and let them be filled with messages from thee. Take my silver and will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is thine own. It shall be thy royal throne. It shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. Take myself and I will be ever only all for thee, ever only all for thee. Dear God, go with us now, and may we truly live our lives ever and only for you. Take us as we are. Don't leave us this way. Transform us into the people you desire us to be so that we can continue being your hands and your feet in spite of everything else going on around us. Go with us. Help us during this new week ahead. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen.